He walked into her apartment at 2 a.m., completely covered in blood that wasn't his. Dominic Lavelle told Lily he handled problems for a living. What he meant was he erased anyone who dared to threaten her. When a rival mafia boss sent Lily a death threat, Dominic didn't call the cops. He wiped out the entire threat before sunrise, just so she could sleep peacefully. Is it true love or pure terrifying obsession?
Let us open the case file on the subject we shall call Lily. We begin our observation at the precipice of her psychological descent. It was a freezing November midnight outside a velvet-draped establishment. Her cellular device was completely unresponsive. The biting ambient temperature forced her to cross her arms, a defensive posture indicating extreme vulnerability. She had only arrived due to peer pressure from a colleague. You and I must carefully note the danger of ignoring our own boundaries. The lesson here is profound. When we abandon our own comfort zones simply to please others, we inadvertently position ourselves as the perfect target for a predator. Her distress was palpable, making her an optimal mark. Lily's psychological baseline was profoundly insulated. Her daily routine was confined to the sterile environment of a library and a modest apartment shared solely with a feline companion. Her highest emotional arousal is from literary releases. Abandoned by her associate, Emma, the subject was marooned in an unfamiliar territory without communication tools or physical currency. The escalating anxiety of her spatial disorientation created the perfect vacuum for intervention. It teaches us a grim reality. Isolation is the soil where manipulation takes root. When the tavern doors expelled a sudden rush of heat and auditory chaos, her hypervigilance forced her to turn. That was the precise moment she made visual contact with the primary aggressor. The male subject, Dominic, presented with the calculated aesthetic of a high-tier criminal architect. His dark attire functioned as an intimidation tactic, while his physical presence seemed to absorb the ambient light, a hallmark of the megalomaniac narcissist dominating his environment. Two enforcers flanked his position, providing a physical manifestation of his systemic power. Though Lily immediately initiated an avoidance response, her physiological panic escalating her heart rate, Dominic initiated verbal contact. His identification of her vulnerable state, noting her dead device, was a calculated intrusion. It reminds us that predators do not hunt for strength, they scan for a fractured defense. When she finally turned, he had closed the distance with predatory silence. "I am fine," the subject stated, though her vocal tremors immediately betrayed her internal terror. Dominic systematically dismantled her denial, coldly observing she had been stationary for 20 minutes. This revelation of his prolonged surveillance was designed to induce a feeling of inescapable containment. When he declared she would not be walking, the sheer authoritative weight of his narcissistic certainty forced an involuntary postural compliance in Lily. He produced a high-end cellular device, offering it as a manufactured lifeline. Let us pause here. You and I must recognize this tactic. It is a vital lesson in behavioral psychology. The most inescapable traps in life are rarely forced upon us. They are usually handed to us disguised as a sudden salvation. Every nonverbal cue emanating from Dominic and his armed subordinates broadcasted severe lethality. When the victim questioned his motives, he employed a classic fear-based manipulation, explicitly detailing the statistical probability of her abduction in that sector. This mechanism isolates the target, positioning the predator as the sole savior from an abstract environmental threat. As he breached her intimate space, she noted his olfactory signature, a dark cedar scent that anchored his presence in her sensory memory. The physical transfer of the device involved intentional tactile contact. This calculated warmth triggered a neurological spike within Lily. It teaches us that human touch, when starved, can instantly override our most primal survival instincts. The interface displayed a singular contact identifier, the letter D. When Lily expressed cognitive dissonance, Dominic immediately suppressed her critical thinking, stating she did not need to understand. Simultaneously, a previously undetected black vehicle materialized, an orchestrated display of his logistical resources. When an enforcer offered vehicular transport, Lily's self-preservation instinct triggered a sharp refusal. Dominic reinforced this boundary setting with verbal validation, calling her a smart girl, a paternalistic reward mechanism designed to accelerate compliance. He framed his continued surveillance not as a threat, but as a protective necessity. The lesson is chilling. Control is most absolute when the victim believes it is actually care. The absence of a security protocol on the device was a calculated anomaly, ensuring frictionless execution of his demands. Lily successfully established contact with her roommate, securing civilian extraction within 10 minutes. Upon attempting to terminate the interaction and return the hardware, Dominic initiated a hard boundary denial. He transitioned from suggestion to outright behavioral conditioning, lowering his vocal register to bypass her logical processing centers. He dictated a highly specific sequence of actions, returning to base, securing her perimeter, and confirming compliance. Although her baseline psychological profile should have registered extreme outrage, the initial stages of captor fixation had begun. True dominance rarely requires raising one's voice. Before withdrawing, the subject extracted her primary identifier. She surrendered the name Lily with zero resistance, bypassing her own survival protocols. You and I must analyze the micro-expression that followed, a dangerous synthesis of predatory hunger and rigid impulse control. He tested the phonetics of her name, integrating it into his proprietary framework. As he entered his secure transport, he issued rapid-fire survival directives. When she desperately attempted to extract his identity, in return, he offered only the cryptic confirmation that she already possessed it. The silent departure of his vehicle mirrored the tactical withdrawal of an apex predator. The harsh reality here is that curiosity, once weaponized by a psychopath, becomes the ultimate tether. During transit, she maintained physical possession of the illicit hardware. Upon breaching her apartment, the logical course of action was clear. Terminate the contact protocol and surrender the device to law enforcement. Instead, we witness the terrifying efficacy of the Stockholm Syndrome taking hold. Driven by compulsion, she initiated the sequence. The immediate connection indicated he was actively monitoring the channel. His vocal tone had shifted to an artificial intimacy, verifying her physical containment with a query about the locks. When he terminated the call, Lily was left experiencing massive autonomic dysregulation. If there is a lesson to extract from this clinical disaster, it is that our broken minds will often choose a comforting captor over a cold reality. Her established reality, a highly controlled, predictably mundane environment, had sustained a catastrophic structural fracture. She had become hyperfixated on an aggressor who projected the illusion of total psychological penetration. Predictably, her circadian rhythms collapsed. She experienced severe insomnia, her cognitive loops dominated by his ocular intensity and his vocalization of her name. Alarmingly, Returning the device was no longer viewed as a necessary security measure, but as an anticipated reunion. By morning, the black cellular device sat upon her workstation like an unexploded psychological munition. We must understand a fundamental human flaw. A life devoid of emotional chaos will often unconsciously crave the very fire that intends to burn it down. Let us observe her deteriorating behavioral baseline in a social setting. Despite the absence of digital stimuli, the object exerted a gravitational pull on her psyche. Her co-worker correctly identified her anomalies, noting repetitive, nonsensical motor actions. When interrogated about potential romantic distress, Lily engaged in active deception, a key indicator of victim isolation. During her midday break, she finally analyzed the device's architecture. It was a digital ghost town. No historical data, no secondary contacts. A closed-loop communication system designed exclusively to foster dependency. It was during this systematic search that she discovered a physical credential card. The tragic lesson is that secrecy is the mortar with which a prison of the mind is built. The artifact was constructed of dense material, bearing only a name and location in silver typography. Dominic Lavelle. The subject immediately initiated open-source intelligence gathering. The results were remarkably sterile. While his name appeared on philanthropic registries, a classic laundering technique for high-profile megalomaniacs, there was an absolute void of personal data or digital footprint. He operated entirely within the negative space of the public record. Granted premature release from her occupational duties, Lily was left entirely unsupervised with the psychological bait. Her internal monologue briefly rationalized safe disposal methods, but her pathological core curiosity had already proven fatal. The abyss does not reach out, it simply waits for you to peer into it. Within 20 minutes, her behavioral conditioning overriding all logical resistance, Lily transported herself back to the locus of her initial trauma. Under solar illumination, the structure presented a less hostile facade, yet maintained an oppressive architectural dominance. Upon breaching the interior, she encountered a subordinate performing maintenance. The initial verbal rejection was instantly countermanded the moment Lily produced the specialized communication device. The subordinate's immediate visual recognition and subsequent withdrawal signaled Dominic's absolute systemic control over his personnel. Left isolated in the cavernous interior, Lily experienced an acute spike in socioeconomic inferiority. It is a stark reminder that true power relies on silent compliance. The primary aggressor materialized, his entrance meticulously timed to maximize psychological suspense. In standard daylight, you and I can now register the microdills of his pathology. A facial scar hinted at a history of profound violence, juxtaposed against a timepiece worth an annual salary. He utilized her name again, weaponizing the syllables to reinforce their artificial intimacy. When she offered the device, he deliberately delayed compliance. Instead, he breached her proximal zone, his gaze conducting a systematic dissection. As he finally reclaimed the hardware, he engineered a secondary tactile exchange, solidifying the trauma bond. The enduring lesson of this case is simple. True monsters do not break down the door. They wait for us to hand them the key. Let us open this case file and examine the initial phase of grooming. You and I are going to unpack this story together, looking past the romance into the pathology. The subject, Dominic, initiates contact with a classic destabilization tactic. He notes the dark shadows beneath Lily's eyes and her nervous habit of touching her necklace. This is not genuine concern, It is the calculated observation of a megalomaniac narcissist identifying a vulnerability. He bluntly points out that she sacrificed her lunch hour just to see him, forcing an uncomfortable admission of her own irrational pull toward him. Lily is terrified because his assessment is flawlessly accurate. When he asks if she has eaten, he is already laying the groundwork for total psychological dependence. Notice how the illusion of choice is systematically dismantled. Dominic commands her to eat with him, effortlessly overriding her professional obligations. He casually reveals that he watched her check her watch 3 times, a predatory level of surveillance that he repackages as protective instinct. This is the precise moment the seeds of Stockholm Syndrome are planted. Lily's biological survival instincts are screaming at her to run from this dangerous stranger. Yet, the megalomaniac frames his controlling behavior as a shield against a hostile world. He states, with absolute, chilling certainty, that they are only strangers for now. Overwhelmed by his dominant certainty, her defenses collapse, and she simply nods, surrendering her autonomy. The subject then isolates his target, moving Lily into a private, tightly controlled environment. It is a masculine, heavy room lined with leather and books, a space designed to project authority and wealth. He has already prepared a meal from an impossibly expensive restaurant, proving he anticipated her compliance. As they eat in heavy silence, he begins probing her psychological defenses. She confesses her love for her library job because it represents order and safety. Dominic immediately challenges this fragile worldview. He forces her to confront the sheer terror she felt the night before, clinically reinforcing the idea that her perceived safety is an illusion and only he can provide true security. Here we see the megalomaniac narcissist openly display his grandiosity. Dominic casually mentions that he owns the entire 6-block radius, including the very ground they stand on. This is a deliberate demonstration of resource control. When Lily asks what he does for a living, he offers a chillingly vague response about solving problems. She correctly identifies the layers of violent secrecy beneath his polished exterior. Her instinct prompts her to ask if she should be afraid of him. A normal person would offer reassurance. Dominic, however, employs brutal, paralyzing honesty. He tells her yes, she should be afraid, but grants her a temporary reprieve for the day. He uses fear as a tether to bind her closer. Stick with me. This is where the manipulation becomes truly insidious. Dominic presents Lily with a false sense of freedom, stating she can decide tomorrow if she ever wants to see him again. But he immediately follows this with a threat masked as benevolence. If she refuses, he will continue to monitor and protect her from a distance. He is normalizing stalking. When she asks why he chose her, he deploys a masterclass in psychological mirroring. He claims she is the first person in a long time to look at him with a desire for trust rather than expectation. By framing himself as a lonely, misunderstood figure, he triggers her empathy, ensuring that her budding Stockholm Syndrome will masquerade as profound emotional connection. But the physical anchoring phase begins at the threshold of the door. Dominic places a barely perceptible hand on the small of her back, a possessive, territorial gesture. He programs her phone with his number and explicitly instructs her to call him when she feels frightened. He recognizes that she desires something thrilling to shatter the mundane reality of her cataloging job. He purposefully refrains from kissing her, leaving her starved for the physical contact he just teased. As she walks away into the daylight, the cognitive dissonance is complete. She believes she is making an independent choice to pursue a romantic spark, entirely blind to the fact that the trap has already been securely fastened around her wrists. You and I have probably both witnessed people make self-destructive choices, but clinical observation requires us to look at the mechanics behind the mistake. Lily endures 4 agonizing days of withdrawal. The narcissist does not chase. He simply waits for the psychological venom to take effect. On the 4th night, isolated in the vulnerability of her bedroom, her manufactured obsession peaks. She texts him, and his instantaneous reply proves he has been monitoring his web, waiting for the vibration of the thread. When he presses her on what she is thinking about, she abandons all self-preservation and types a single fatal word. She admits she is thinking of him. The trap violently springs shut, and her phone begins to ring. In the stark isolation of the night, his rough voice bridges the distance, creating an artificial intimacy. Lily is acutely aware of her physical vulnerability, sitting alone in a thin shirt, speaking to a known predator. She verbally articulates her own Stockholm syndrome, confessing that she cannot stop thinking about a man who genuinely terrifies her. Dominic does not soften her fear. He validates it, telling her that her terror is a good thing. The megalomaniac narcissist requires the victim's fear just as much as their affection, as both are simply different flavors of absolute control. When she desperately begs to know what he really does, he punishes her with a heavy, suffocating silence, maintaining his dominance. He finally answers with a sterile euphemism, claiming he manages interests. Before she can process the evasion, he issues a directive masked as an invitation. He mandates that she come to his private residence for dinner, isolating her entirely from public view where restaurants might have ears. He promises she will be safe with him, a deeply paradoxical vow from the very man causing her distress. Every rational neurological signal in Lily's brain screams at her to decline, to survive, yet the subjugation is so thorough that she simply agrees. He orchestrates every logistical detail, ensuring she takes no independent action. It is a quiet, devastating surrender of her free will, packaged neatly as a romantic evening. His quiet amusement at her feeble attempt to assert boundaries is chilling. He hangs up, denying her the final word, asserting his absolute authority over the interaction. The following afternoon operates with military precision. A black car arrives, piloted by the same imposing enforcer from their first encounter. The silent driver acts as an extension of the narcissist's will, opening the door and sealing her inside. As the vehicle glides out of the familiar, safe city streets and enters a heavily fortified neighborhood of staggering wealth, the physical displacement mirrors her psychological isolation. She is being transported far beyond the reach of her normal life, entirely dependent on the machinery of her captor. The sheer scale of his estate is a weapon of intimidation. The stone and glass mansion serves to reinforce his godlike status in her mind. The driver's casual remark that his employer does nothing halfway is a subtle warning of the absolute possession that awaits her. When Dominic appears, the visual manipulation is striking. By wearing casual denim and rolled-up sleeves, he presents a disarming, grounded image that directly contradicts the overwhelming opulence of his fortress. He offers his hand, and she takes it, willingly stepping into the lion's den. The interior is filled with historic art, yet purposefully arranged to feel warm, further confusing her threat assessment protocols with false comfort. Let us look at this piece by piece, shall we? He leads her deep into the physical core of his territory, a pristine kitchen of marble and cold steel. He pours dark red wine, ensuring their fingers lightly collide in a calculated test of her physical response. He clinicalizes her nervous state, forcing her to verbalize her entirely justified fear of being alone in a compound with a secretive, powerful man. When she admits her anxiety, he rewards her compliance with a faint smile. Then, the performance begins. He begins to cook. For a megalomaniac who commands armies of men, performing a domestic nurturing task is a highly effective cognitive distortion. It forces the victim to view the predator as a gentle provider. She admits her surprise, having expected a man of his dangerous stature to rely on invisible servants. Dominic uses this opening to deploy a fabricated vulnerability. He claims cooking is one of the few things he does purely for himself, creating a tragic, lonely persona for her to pity. This is the grooming mechanism evolving into the love-bombing phase. He turns to face her, locking her in his singular focus, and confesses that she has gotten under his skin. He identifies her exact insecurities and counters them by declaring her extraordinary, kind, and uniquely genuine. He mirrors her deepest unspoken desires back to her, ensuring the Stockholm Syndrome binds them tightly. She is no longer a captive. She feels chosen. We have reached the critical juncture of the case file. He invades her intimate space, closing the physical gap until she can see the gold flecks in his dark eyes and feel his radiating body heat. He issues a final, brilliant illusion of consent. He tells her to demand that he step back. It is the ultimate psychological trap. Her mind knows she should retreat, but the trauma bond is fully calcified. When she freezes, paralyzed by the conflicting desires for safety and destruction, he rewards her submission by tenderly touching her hair. She stands willingly at the edge of a dangerous abyss. The simple truth we must remember here is that a cage does not become a home just because the door is left open. The victim is entirely his. Let us open this file together. You and I, we observe the subject, Dominic, initiating classic predatory grooming. The physical touch, a thumb along her jaw, is a calculated test of boundaries. When he promises to catch her, he is establishing the foundational lie of the megalomaniac narcissist, that he is her sole savior. The sensory details of the dinner, the perfectly seasoned pasta, the meticulously baked bread are environmental controls. He uses the memory of his deceased grandmother to manufacture vulnerability, presenting a wounded inner child. He claims she was the last person to see his true self. This is textbook psychological manipulation designed to make the victim feel uniquely chosen. Notice how he frames his pathology. He claims he became someone who makes difficult decisions so others can remain unburdened. This is the grandiose rationalization typical of a megalomaniac narcissist. He is not a criminal in his own mind. He is a dark messiah carrying the weight of the world. When Lily whispers that his life sounds lonely, she is falling perfectly into the trap. She feels empathy for her captor, moving the environment to a grand, wall-to-wall library is a targeted strike on her specific vulnerabilities. He knows she values literature, so he weaponizes it, offering her a boundless collection. This grand gesture cements his role as a provider of her deepest desires. The library interaction is crucial for our clinical understanding. Lily admits that books were her escape mechanism when life felt overwhelming. By offering her this sanctuary, Dominic is positioning himself as the ultimate safe haven. When she looks at him and confesses she no longer wants to disappear, we witness the genesis of Stockholm Syndrome. The victim is willingly stepping off the ledge, mistaking the predator's gravity for love. The subsequent drive back to her apartment is heavy with manufactured inevitability. He escorts her directly to the door, ensuring his physical presence dominates her personal space. She admits her fear, and he simply acknowledges it, validating her emotional state while ignoring the fact that he is the source of the danger. We must carefully examine this morning after sequence. His lingering at her door, praising her supposed bravery, is a classic reinforcement tactic. He is rewarding her compliance with psychological validation. The next day, the arrival of dozens of white roses in an expensive crystal vase is not a romantic gesture. It is an act of territorial marking. This love-bombing phase is designed to overwhelm her cognitive defenses. Her co-worker, Emma, correctly identifies them as a statement, though she misses the sinister undertone. Lily finds herself entirely unable to explain the dynamic to an outsider, an isolating mechanism that severs her from normal social support. She is already beginning to construct the psychological walls of her own captivity. Lily experiences severe cognitive dissonance, feeling completely seen yet utterly terrified. Her internal alarm bells urge her to create distance, but the trauma bond is already taking root. When she texts him, his rapid response further feeds her emotional starvation. But the controlled environment shatters at 2 o'clock. A coworker rushes in, pale and shaking, announcing the arrival of dangerous men. This external threat is the perfect catalyst for the captor's victory. In behavioral analysis, a sudden spike in fear accelerates attachment to the primary protector. The men invading her workplace are not just a physical threat. They are the heavy hammer that will inevitably drive the final, inescapable nail right into the foundation of her psychological cage. The newly arrived threat lacks the refined polish of our megalomaniac narcissist. These men represent a crude, unfiltered violence that heavily contrasts with Dominic's curated image. The tallest intruder demands her compliance, explicitly linking her to Dominic Lavelle. This confirms her worst fears. Her association with him has made her a target. The physical intimidation escalates rapidly as the intruder exposes a concealed weapon. She is presented with a false choice: come quietly or provoke a violent scene in a public space. This paralyzing terror is exactly what the psychological profile requires. In her mind, she is completely defenseless, primed for a savior to intervene. She is standing on the precipice of total dependency. Stick with me here, because this intervention is a masterpiece of dark psychology. Just as Lily is forced toward the exit, her mind fractured by panic, the doors burst open. Dominic arrives, perfectly timed, flanked by his own enforcers. He surveys the terrifying scene, absorbing her fear and the physical grip of the rival thug. His absolute coldness in the face of this threat instantly establishes his dominance. He commands the man to let her go with a quiet, lethal authority. The sheer force of his presence causes the rival to falter. When Lily stumbles forward and Dominic pulls her behind his own body, he completes the visual metaphor. He is the impenetrable shield. Her brain immediately encodes him as her singular source of survival. The verbal exchange that follows is a display of apex predator behavior. Dominic directly challenges the rival faction, led by a man named Russo, asserting extreme territorial dominance, when Lily weakly attempts to de-escalate by mentioning the library students. Dominic merely uses her plea to justify his impending violence. He promises that any future approach will be considered an act of war. It is not empty talk. It is a binding declaration. Once the threat departs, we see the most manipulative tactic of all. He frames her face, allowing her to see genuine fear in his eyes. Showing this vulnerability to the victim achieves a profound emotional lock. She believes this Kingpin is afraid strictly for her, blinding her to his monstrous nature. Look closely at how he handles the immediate aftermath. He frantically checks her for injuries, pulling her against his chest so she can feel his accelerated heartbeat. This physiological proof of his distress acts as an emotional anchor, deepening the Stockholm Syndrome. He dictates their immediate departure, stripping away her autonomy while framing it as urgent protection. When they reach his vehicle, he immediately dispatches a massive security detail to her home, demanding eyes on every entrance, regardless of the financial cost. He is building a fortress around her, which is practically indistinguishable from a prison. Finally, he offers a soft, surprising apology. This calculated contrition confuses her natural defense mechanisms entirely. You and I are going to look at this confession together because it is crucial. When she demands to know the nature of his business, he finally drops the veil. He admits to managing territories and resolving disputes outside the law. He describes his involvement in organized crime not as a moral failing, but as the noble maintenance of order amidst chaos. This is the ultimate grandiosity of the megalomaniac narcissist. He sanitizes his brutality, presenting himself as a necessary evil that holds society together. The truth hits her like a physical blow. He is a mafia kingpin. By offering this confession after saving her life, he ensures she processes his criminality through a lens of deep, misguided gratitude rather than appropriate horror. Clinically speaking, her reaction is exactly what we expect from a developing trauma bond. Instead of demanding to be released, she begins analyzing her own strategic value to a rival family. She assumes she is merely a bargaining chip. Dominic aggressively counters this, fiercely declaring that she is someone he genuinely cares about. He promises to burn the entire city to the ground before allowing anyone to harm her. This apocalyptic declaration of devotion overwhelms her logical mind. She whispers that the situation is crazy and acknowledges that she should run away and disappear forever. Yet she remains seated beside him. He reaches out, takes her hand, and confidently states that she will not run. He is entirely certain of his psychological conquest. Why does she stay? He provides the answer for her, dictating her internal emotional state. He claims she feels the identical magnetic pull that he does, completely blurring the line between his desires and her own. When she helplessly asks what she should do, he gives the ultimate command of the captor. Let me protect you. He demands total trust while refusing to explain how the violent conflict will actually be resolved. Upon arriving at her apartment, the physical invasion begins. He meticulously sweeps every room and every window, watching this incredibly dangerous, violent man move through her safe space of books and modest furniture creates a surreal, intoxicating contrast in her mind. Her sanctuary has now officially become his occupied territory. The establishment of the perimeter is a defining trait of isolation. He informs her of the constant security detail that will monitor her every move, wrapping his surveillance in the comforting language of safety. When she protests that she cannot live this way, he bluntly states that his protection is non-negotiable. If she refuses, he will simply stalk her from a distance. He then displays a masterful stroke of manipulation, showing deep exhaustion and sorrow. He laments that she deserves a normal, safe life, free from his inherent darkness. This self-deprecation forces the victim to comfort the abuser. She immediately dismisses her own need for a normal life, proving that the psychological conditioning is now deeply, irreversibly embedded. Let us look at this piece together. Dominic searched her eyes for vulnerability. Lily admitted her terror but refused to flee. Dominic suggested she run, a classic tactic of the megalomaniacal narcissist, offering a false choice to ensure she stays. When Lily stepped closer, we observed the terrifying reality of Stockholm Syndrome. He cupped her cheek with calculated gentleness, masking his inherent violence. He called her brave, reinforcing his control, then made a theatrical display of checking her locks. As Lily watched the black SUV take position outside, she believed she was being guarded. Clinically, she was being contained. The lesson here is simple but haunting. The most dangerous prisons are the ones we mistake for safe havens. Let us open this case file together, shall we? You and I are going to dissect a textbook example of psychological capture. Within 7 days, the subject, Lily, exhibited profound cognitive dissonance. She recognized the mortal threat of organized crime, yet rather than fleeing, she initiated contact, sending Dominic a message regarding his safety. His immediate response established a false sense of security, a classic tactic of the megalomaniac narcissist. She sat in her apartment, her feline companion beside her, rationalizing her proximity to violence. Dominic framed his impending gang war as a romantic crusade for her honor, effectively neutralizing her survival instincts. She was subjected to hypervigilance, shadowed by armed guards, while pacified by domestic provisions. The pathology of isolation often begins with covert financial control. Dominic secretly paid her rent for 3 months, bypassing her consent and establishing a psychological debt. He employed mirroring, leaving desired literature on her doorstep and engaging in prolonged, nocturnal interrogations masked as intimate conversation. He exchanged curated vulnerabilities, like a preference for jazz and history, to extract her deepest insecurities. When she confessed a fear of inadequacy regarding her writing, he provided absolute, unfounded validation. This manufactured certainty triggered profound emotional dependency. Notice how physical separation amplified the bond. He remained an omnipotent figure, quietly orchestrating a violent confrontation with his rival, Rousseau, while acting as her savior. By the 4th evening, the predator escalated the isolation phase. Dominic instructed her to relocate to his fortress under the guise of ultimate protection. When he sensed microscopic hesitation, he deployed a precise emotional lever, confessing that he missed her. In my clinical experience, this is the exact moment the victim's rational defenses collapse. The subject documented feeling anticipation rather than appropriate terror during her transport. Upon arrival, Dominic presented himself as physically exhausted, a calculated display of vulnerability designed to trigger her maternal nurturing instincts. When he initiated physical contact, her autonomic nervous system misread captivity as sanctuary. She buried her face against his chest, interpreting trauma bond physiology as coming home. The environment was meticulously engineered to disorient her reality. Dominic utilized sensory manipulation, serving a seemingly flawless meal on a terrace while exploiting the natural aesthetic of a sunset. When she remarked on the beauty of her gilded cage, he injected a narrative of chronic loneliness, positioning her as his sole emotional remedy. This feeds the narcissist's requirement for a symbiotic savior dynamic. He then established a superficial physical boundary by assigning her a separate bedroom, a highly effective pacification strategy. By explicitly stating that she possessed absolute autonomy over her physical safety, he eliminated her remaining subconscious alarms. She looked into the eyes of a lethal syndicate leader and diagnosed him as harmless, sealing her subjugation. A crucial component of this dynamic is the illusion of domestic normalcy. They occupied a library, engaging in parallel activities that simulated long-term intimacy. This artificially accelerated timeline is a hallmark of coercive control. When she fell asleep, Dominic bypassed her verbal assertion of independence, choosing to physically carry her to the bed, reinforcing his dominance while masquerading as caretaking. His use of a gentle endearment triggered a dopamine response in her brain, solidifying the trauma bond. The subject, desperate to avoid emotional isolation, explicitly requested his continued presence. He demonstrated calculated restraint by lying above the covers, an action serving to convince the subject that he was a protector rather than a predator, cementing her reliance. In the sensory deprivation of a darkened room, she initiated a probe for authenticity, demanding a truth he withheld from the world. Dominic recognized this as an opportunity to secure absolute loyalty. He verbalized a fabricated fatigue regarding his position of power, claiming a desire for emotional softness. This is a textbook manipulative maneuver designed to elicit profound empathy. It was highly effective. Cracking her final emotional barriers, she offered herself as his sanctuary, taking his hand. He countered by projecting a fantasy of a peaceful, normal life entirely incompatible with his behavioral reality as a crime boss. By presenting this unattainable utopian vision, he forced her to actively reject her own reality and propose the creation of a shared delusion. Analyze this interaction closely with me. Dominic tested her psychological compliance by asking if she would forfeit her physical safety for their shared fantasy. Her willingness to embrace mortal risk demonstrates the severe cognitive impairment of Stockholm Syndrome. He then employed a classic reversal tactic, accusing her of being the destructive force in his life. Her brain, flooded with oxytocin, interpreted his dark amusement as profound beauty. They slept in a state of manufactured innocence. By morning, he had systematically invaded her physical boundaries, enveloping her completely. He demonstrated a predatory awareness of her physiological, noting a microscopic shift in her respiration. She found this invasive surveillance comforting rather than alarming. He sought retroactive consent for his physical envelopment, a manipulation tactic designed to make the victim feel empowered within her own subjugation. She eagerly confirmed her compliance. When she questioned the future regarding the elimination of his rival, Rousseau, Dominic employed vague, grandiose promises of creating a new world. This megalomaniacal assertion requires a complete detachment from reality, yet she accepted it as profound truth. The subject observed him in the morning light, noting his unkempt hair and softened gaze, projecting an illusion of boyish innocence onto a highly dangerous man. As he touched her face, the dynamic shifted from calculated restraint to overt predatory desire. She was rapidly transitioning into a target for total physical consumption. Look closely at this verbal exchange. You and I can clearly see the architecture of coercive escalation. He introduced the concept of broken promises, framing his impending physical escalation as an unavoidable loss of control. By stating he was close to crossing his own boundaries, he placed the burden of regulation onto the victim. He utilized the language of protection, claiming she deserved a careful approach, fully knowing this would trigger her rebellious compliance. Infected by the adrenaline of the trauma bond, she explicitly rejected safety, demanding recklessness. He warned her that his control was fragile, effectively absolving himself of responsibility. Convinced she was the agent of her own destiny, She initiated the physical contact, blind to the invisible strings attached. The physical connection served as the biological reinforcement of her subjugation. What began as a seemingly gentle interaction rapidly devolving into an assertion of primal dominance. He manipulated the physical geometry, controlling her movements as the intensity spiked. The subject described the experience as consuming, an incredibly accurate pathological assessment of a narcissist or a host. He utilized dramatic hyperbole, claiming she would cause his demise, a statement flattering her ego while masking his lethality. They remained isolated in the physical space, establishing an artificial vacuum devoid of external reality. He maintained strict boundaries during this encounter, not out of respect, but to foster absolute trust, ensuring her psychological defenses were dismantled. He abruptly reinstated his psychological armor, utilizing the persona of the gentleman to re-establish dominance and control the pacing of the interaction. They spent the subsequent hours engaging in highly normalized behaviors, wandering the perimeter and preparing food. The subject correctly identified this phase as playing house, a temporary dissociation from the imminent gang warfare surrounding them. The therapeutic illusion shattered the moment the external world intruded via a telephonic interruption. As Dominic observed the incoming communication, his micro-expressions shifted instantly. The manufactured softness dissolved, replaced entirely by the rigid, hypervigilant posture of an apex predator preparing for conflict. She watched the illusion evaporate, completely helpless to stop it. You and I must recognize the behavioral shift that occurred here. The romantic facade was discarded, and the primary pathological identity, the syndicate leader, reclaimed. Total dominance. Dominic informed her of an impending confrontation with the rival, Russo. He weaponized this violent meeting, framing it entirely as a noble sacrifice required to ensure her personal safety and secure their utopian future. This effectively burdened her with the emotional responsibility for his violent actions. He demanded a reciprocal promise of caution, establishing a manufactured symmetry in their risk profiles. His farewell kiss was designed to instill a profound sense of impending loss, locking her into an anxious state. Even her subconscious recognized the preceding hours as a fabricated calm. The subject awoke to physical abandonment, a sharp contrast designed to trigger immediate abandonment anxiety. She located him in a state of operational command, utilizing his native language, further alienating her from his core reality. He immediately issued directives regarding her biological needs and logistical relocation, stripping away the illusion of their shared partnership. When she attempted to assert autonomy and remain, he shut her down with a non-negotiable refusal. He rapidly softened his tone, citing his impending war as the justification for her dismissal. This blunt injection of brutal reality triggered an acute physiological shock in the subject. He then employed intermittent reinforcement, physically embracing her to soothe the psychological wound he deliberately inflicted. Today, you and I are going to unpack the pathology of a trauma bond. Notice how the subject, Lily, attempts to negotiate with an apex predator. She begs Dominic to stay, prioritizing his safety over her own moral compass. This is classic dissonance. Dominic, displaying the textbook traits of a megalomaniacal narcissist, frames his violent territoriality as protection. He dictates that touching her is an act of war. When she attempts to internalize the guilt, whispering that this impending violence is her fault, he swiftly manipulates the narrative. He claims it is about other men taking what is not theirs, reducing her to property while masquerading as a savior. This is the hook of Stockholm Syndrome. Let us open this clinical file together and observe the genesis of a textbook trauma bond. Dominic, a classic megalomaniac narcissist, positioned himself as Lily's ultimate savior. He kissed her forehead, an act of paternalistic control, warning her of the violent consequences of his own lifestyle. He instructed her to rely solely on his enforcer, Carlo, isolating her further. When Carlo secured her apartment and stood guard outside, Lily was effectively imprisoned, pacing her cage in a state of acute hypervigilance. The kingpin orchestrated this anxiety intentionally. By making himself the center of her terror and her only perceived path to safety, he planted the seeds of a deep psychological dependency that would soon consume her entire identity. In the early stages of Stockholm Syndrome, the subject often experiences severe cognitive dissonance. Lily attempted to anchor herself to reality by calling her mother and feeding her pet, but her mind was entirely hijacked by her captor's impending violence. When the kingpin finally called, his voice was clinically detached. He demanded she remain brave, further solidifying her role in his grand narcissistic narrative. She begged him not to speak of his own demise, a clear indicator that her emotional survival was now inextricably linked to his physical one. He casually mentioned contingency plans with Carlo, employing psychological manipulation to ensure she remained compliant and entirely dependent on his overarching authority, even in his absence. Note the transactional nature of his promises: wealth, protection, a gilded cage. Yet Lily's response, rejecting the material for the man himself, illustrates the terrifying depth of her psychological capture. She pleaded for his safe return, entirely subsumed by his magnetic pull. As she scrubbed her already spotless kitchen, manifesting her internal chaos through obsessive-compulsive repetition, external reality violently intruded. Anonymous messages arrived, attempting to pierce the veil of her denial. They labeled the kingpin a monster, attaching surveillance imagery of his armed syndicate. It was a direct confrontation with the empirical truth of his sociopathy, a brutal disruption to the carefully curated fantasy she had eagerly embraced. Faced with undeniable evidence of a predator's true nature, the human survival instinct typically dictates immediate flight. Instead, Lily blocked the sender. Her shaking hands betrayed a profound autonomic nervous system response, yet she rationalized the visual proof of his criminality by reminding herself he had never claimed innocence. This is a hallmark defense mechanism in trauma victims. When her friend Emma called to report a suspicious individual inquiring about Lily's whereabouts, the paranoia escalated from an abstract concept to an immediate environmental threat. The megalomaniac's dangerous orbit was now actively swallowing Lily's civilian life, replacing her previously safe existence with a persistent state of clinical terror. The isolation phase accelerated beautifully here. When Emma expressed genuine concern, Lily immediately severed the social tether, instructing her friend to remain silent. She actively protected the very criminal enterprise that was endangering her. Rebuffed by the kingpin's voicemail, she defaulted to Carlo, the institutional guardian of her captivity. Carlo's sterile command to lock her doors only heightened her sympathetic nervous system's arousal. As midnight passed without the promised communication, Lily's psychological state deteriorated into severe dysregulation. She was vibrating with somatic anxiety. She was no longer a free agent. She was a conditioned subject, entirely dependent on the intermittent reinforcement of her captor's voice. By 2 in the morning, her cortisol levels had undoubtedly reached toxic thresholds. When the knock finally came, her cardiovascular system reacted violently, despite clear instructions from the security apparatus to remain barricaded. The sound of the narcissist's rough, exhausted voice overrode all logical preservation instincts. She threw the door open and launched her body against his. This physical collision represents a massive dopamine rush, effectively cementing the trauma bond. He stood before her, disheveled but victorious, absorbing her frantic energy. Her desperate accusation regarding his broken promise of a midnight call was not a demand for accountability. It was a submissive plea for his continued psychological regulation. You and I must closely analyze the specific phrasing he uses here. The kingpin stepped into her civilian sanctuary, a dangerous anomaly polluting her safe environment, yet her warped perception registered his presence as comforting. He proudly announced that rival factions had agreed to his terms, framing her safety as a diplomatic triumph. He claimed he surrendered lucrative criminal territory to ensure her protection, whispering that she was worth more than land. This is the ultimate manipulation of a megalomaniac narcissist. By declaring that she was his to protect, he legally reclassified her from an autonomous human being into a prized possession. He successfully masked his territorial dominance as a profound act of romantic devotion. A fascinating psychological pivot occurs in this exact interaction. Lily experienced a dark, twisted relief, presenting the anonymous threats to him like an offering to a dark deity. The kingpin processed the surveillance imagery with sociopathic detachment, immediately diagnosing it as a rival's test of her loyalty. He asked if the intimidation tactics had succeeded, offering her a performative out. When she confessed her inability to flee, mocking her own lack of intelligence, he swiftly reframed her profound pathology as superior wisdom. He validated her destructive choice, pulling her tightly against his chest. By telling her she saw something worth staying for, he fed his own grandiose ego while permanently locking her psychological cage. The silence that followed was heavy with mutual dysfunction. He feigned an offer to leave, a classic withdrawal tactic designed to trigger her abandonment anxiety. Predictably, she begged him to stay, unable to tolerate the sudden absence of her new emotional regulator. Moving to the bedroom, the narcissist discarded his shirt, intentionally displaying the physical scars of his violent existence. In a clinical setting, we recognize this as weaponized vulnerability. The scars serve to evoke profound mental pity from the subject. When Lily touched his chest, verbalizing her deep emotional dissent, his calculated response of having already fallen for hers was the final linguistic key, turning in the lock. The Stockholm Syndrome was now fully integrated. Seeking guidance from the very source of her trauma, Lily asked how they would proceed. The megalomaniac, always the architect of their reality, brushed the hair from her face and promised they would construct something genuine amidst the chaos he himself had engineered. He kissed her, dispensing the ultimate narcotic of false hope. She consciously chose to embrace the delusion that a stable environment could be cultivated in the epicenter of a criminal empire. Waking the next morning bathed in sunlight, with a ruthless predator's arm acting as a weighted blanket of security, her brain thoroughly misinterpreted the absence of immediate violence as safety. It is a stunning, tragic rewiring of the human survival mechanism happening in real time. The clinical precision of his observation is chilling. He felt the microscopic tension in her musculature, a predator perfectly attuned to its captive's physiology. When she questioned the reality of their bond, he adopted a softer optical presentation, widening his pupils to mimic genuine vulnerability. He used a highly effective manipulation script, claiming her inherent goodness inspired a desire for his own moral reformation. This is the narcissist's greatest illusion. By confessing that his affection for her was a dangerous liability in his violent underworld, he artificially inflated her perceived value. He painted his pathological need for absolute control as a devastating romance, binding her tighter to his toxic psychology. Let us take a step back and examine the profound paradox of this physical intimacy. She silenced his calculated confessions with a kiss, actively participating in her own psychological subjugation. As his physical mass pinned her to the mattress, her deeply compromised amygdala registered the oppressive weight of a known killer as the ultimate sanctuary. When her sudden intake of breath prompted him to withdraw, he masterfully offered her the illusion of agency. By verbally asserting her trust in a man whose very existence threatened her life, Lily fully completed the cognitive split. He promised to proceed slowly, framing the physical consumption of her autonomy as an act of profound restraint and gentlemanly devotion. The megalomaniac operates strictly through phases, and here we witness the acute idealization phase. He undressed her with performative reverence, continually checking her visual responses. This was not true empathy. It was the meticulous calibration of a captor, ensuring the psychological machinery of his subject was functioning perfectly. He elevated her to the status of a deity, whispering that she was absolute perfection. By eradicating her natural insecurities through intense, focused worship, he became the sole mirror through which she viewed her own worth. Her trembling hands, reaching for him, signified the final collapse of her boundaries. He paused one last time to demand verbal confirmation, effectively washing his hands of moral guilt. We must recognize this final act for what it is, the total consumption of the captive's identity. Stripped of all defenses, she gazed at the physical map of his criminality, the scars and raw power, and perceived only a tragic, terrifying beauty. As he positioned himself, his command to look at him was a psychological tether, ensuring her absolute focus remained locked onto her orchestrator. His gentle, controlled movements were the final application of the trauma bond, effectively fusing her neurological pleasure centers to his capacity for violence. And here lies the simplest, most devastating life lesson of my career. We too often mistake the darkest cage for a sanctuary simply because the monster holding the key speaks to us gently. Open the case file with me and examine the exact moment this trauma bond solidifies. The subject's discomfort evaporated, replaced by intense sensory manipulation. This is a textbook hallmark of Stockholm Syndrome, where a victim confuses relief from fear with profound devotion. "Dominic, I have got you," he murmured, cementing his absolute control. "I have got you, sweetheart." Following a shattering physical release, he chanted her name. As they lay breathing heavily, the megalomaniacal narcissist tested his psychological hold. "Are you okay?" he asked. Her response, "Better than okay," confirmed her cognitive distortion. She touched his face, insisting she felt no regret. The clinical truth we must learn is sobering. Human vulnerability is deeply fragile, and a master manipulator will always paint themselves as your only true safe harbor. He continued his psychological conditioning by feigning remorse, stating he would always regret making her a target. She eagerly absorbed the blame, replying it was her choice, a classic rationalization. They remained tangled in bed as morning bled into afternoon. The predator then orchestrated a simulation of normal domesticity, making eggs and toast in her small kitchen. This surreal comfort further anchored her codependency. "I have to go tonight," he announced over coffee, assigning guards to her building. When she protested that she was already safe from Russo, his megalomaniacal need for control flared. He insisted there were always complications and rogue elements. He commanded her to stay protected under his watch. The lesson is evident. Abusers construct invisible prisons, masking their extreme possessiveness as loving protection to keep the victim utterly dependent. When she asked how long this would last, his answer was absolute. As long as it takes. But over the next week, it acclimated to a pathological rhythm. Dominic would infiltrate her sanctuary late at night, utilizing physical intimacy to reinforce the trauma bond, yet always vanishing before dawn. Her mind actively adapted to the severe abnormality of being shadowed by armed guards. Her co-worker, Emma, observed this psychological shift, noting a distinct glow. When asked if the man was good intense or scary intense, Lily admitted he was both. Emma warned her she had the look of someone who would follow a man entirely into the dark, identifying the profound depth of the Stockholm Syndrome taking root. The victim internally agreed. That evening, the narcissist escalated his grooming by bringing her to a small Italian restaurant, testing her compliance in the public sphere. This public outing served as a controlled stress test. The subject exhibited hypervigilance, whispering that people were staring. The megalomaniac dismissed her anxiety, asserting she would simply get used to his world. To mask her distress, he initiated future faking, a manipulative tactic offering grandiose promises of travel to Paris or Tokyo. Tracing circles on her palm, he claimed he wanted to rediscover the world through her eyes. She easily succumbed to the fantasy. Afterward, he transported her to an isolated lookout point above the city lights, further removing her from normal society. When she mentioned she had not visited the spot since childhood, he probed for familial trauma. She revealed her father had brought her there before abandoning her, unknowingly handing the predator the exact psychological key he needed to completely secure her emotional dependence. She confessed her father vanished when she was 12, revealing a profound abandonment wound. She explained this trauma birthed her desperate need for stability and routine. Dominic, exhibiting rich predatory intuition, instantly weaponized this vulnerability. He acknowledged he was the opposite of stable, prompting her to rationalize his behavior. "But you keep coming back," she noted, misinterpreting his obsessive control as loyalty. He promised he would always return, feeding her desperate need for object constancy. When she cited his lethal criminal lifestyle, his narcissistic grandiosity flared, claiming he would simply avoid dying. Pulling her close, he vowed never to leave her. She kissed him beneath the city lights, choosing emotional delusion over reality. The human mind will readily embrace a beautiful, dangerous lie to avoid facing an agonizing and lonely truth. 2 weeks into the consolidation of the trauma bond, an external reality check shattered their isolated world. The subject was shelving books when an unknown number called. A professional voice identified herself as Agent Sarah Martinez with the FBI, demanding to discuss Dominic. The subject experienced an immediate physiological threat response, as her protective denial was directly challenged. Martinez dismantled her defenses, confirming the Bureau knew about the relationship and the so-called protection Dominic provided. They demanded her cooperation to build a case against his criminal enterprise. Instinctively adopting the role of the loyal captive, Lily immediately denied having any useful knowledge. The agent astutely countered this psychological evasion, pointing out that she knew far more than she realized, and crucially, she possessed intimate access to the primary target. The agent pressed the moral imperative, urging her to help dismantle a dangerous man. The subject's reflex was to defend him, though a brief flash of cognitive clarity forced her to question what she was protecting. Martinez explicitly outlined the narcissist's violent pathology: murders, extortion, and trafficking. When Lily defiantly claimed she already knew what he was, she exhibited classic trauma bonding, aggressively rejecting the label of victim. The agent warned that his world inevitably destroyed innocent people, planting a vital seed of existential doubt. Left trembling among the bookshelves, the subject faced a severe psychological rupture. Let us observe this internal war in real time. Her mind violently oscillated between the empirical facts of his horrific crimes and the manufactured intimacy of a predator who cooked her breakfast and treated her as absolute perfection. The reality of his systemic violence clashed severely with her cultivated delusion. That evening, when the kingpin entered her apartment, her anxiety manifested physically. She avoided eye contact. His hypervigilance instantly detected the behavioral shift. Forcing physical compliance by tilting her chin, he demanded the truth. When she confessed the FBI had made contact, his musculature went rigid, the primal reaction of an apex predator sensing a threat. She revealed the Bureau's request for intelligence. He coldly interrogated her regarding her response. She admitted she had disclosed nothing yet, but confronted him with the allegations of murder. The megalomaniac did not deflect. He confidently affirmed his dangerous nature, utilizing brutal honesty as a highly sophisticated manipulation tactic. When directly asked if he had taken human lives, he held her gaze with deadened eyes and simply said yes. His brutal confession triggered a severe dissociative state in the subject. To prevent her psychological withdrawal, he framed her face with his hands, enforcing visual dominance. He admitted to horrific acts, justifying them as necessary to protect his property. His argument relied on the distorted logic that blunt honesty absolves criminality. He challenged her, asking if she now viewed him as a monster. When she expressed uncertainty, he executed a masterclass in emotional manipulation. Stepping back to create a punishing physical void, he adopted a facade of noble sacrifice. He claimed he would not blame her if she aided the authorities, insisting she deserved a better life. Desperate to maintain the trauma bond, Lily begged him not to be noble. She actively craved his possessive, toxic rage to validate her delusion, pleading with the predator to fight for her total allegiance. His voice roughened with calculated vulnerability. He detailed his struggle against his violent world consuming her, framing his pathological selfishness as a romantic burden. He positioned the FBI as an external contaminant, claiming it was the one battle he could not win. When she desperately asked for his direction, he offered a chilling psychological framework. He instructed her to abandon objective morality and base her decision solely on what emotional weight she could personally carry. This is precisely how predators dismantle ethical boundaries. He promised that if she chose the authorities, he would ensure her protection and entirely erase his existence from her life. Moving toward the exit, he confirmed the severance would be instant. This sudden threat of absolute abandonment is flawlessly designed to trigger catastrophic panic in a deeply codependent mind. Promising to respect her decision, the kingpin departed, leaving the subject trembling on her couch. She was trapped in the epicenter of cognitive dissonance, torn between her mundane reality and his lethal ecosystem. Her conscious mind viewed the choice as impossible, but her trauma-bonded subconscious already knew the outcome. Plagued by insomnia, she spent the night paralyzed in the dark. Let us analyze this psychological paralysis. The agent's factual listing of murders violently collided with her sensory memories of Dominic's gentle hands. The victim weighed empirical evidence of his sociopathy against the intoxicating feeling of being intensely valued by a monster. By dawn, the sheer exhaustion of this mental civil war forced a desperate resolution. She contacted Agent Martinez, agreeing to a formal meeting but immediately initiating a protective transactional negotiation. She demanded legal immunity and guaranteed protection, a logical survival instinct surfacing amid her chaos. Martinez agreed instantly, requesting her presence at the bureau. To orchestrate this, Lily engaged in active deception against her captor's surveillance network. She texted her guard, Carlo, claiming she needed a day off. When Carlo warned that Lavelle would object to this breach of protocol, she firmly demanded space. This assertion of independence was a direct threat to the narcissist's absolute control. The transition to the FBI headquarters provided a stark environmental contrast, sterile and completely stripped of Dominic's romanticized darkness. Inside, Martinez was joined by Agent Torres, whose face radiated the disdain law enforcement often reserves for complicit victims. Lily immediately activated her defensive psychological shield, insisting she possessed no useful criminal intelligence. She rapidly listed her ignorance, claiming she had never witnessed illicit acts. Martinez bypassed this denial, targeting the true asset: her unprecedented access to the kingpin's home, devices, and his fragile trust. When Lily framed the Bureau's request as betraying her sole protector, Torres forcefully intervened. He sought to shatter her cognitive distortion by listing the tyrant's collateral damage, the murdered rivals, and destroyed families. Despite acknowledging his monstrous nature, the subject hesitated. When challenged on this hesitation, the core pathology of Stockholm Syndrome finally crystallized into a devastating conscious admission. She believed she loved him. This profound emotional misattribution struck her with brutal clarity. Overwhelmed by the severe psychological conflict, she stood up and aggressively demanded time to process her fractured reality before making a final commitment. Fleeing the interrogation, she retreated to her habitual sanctuary, but the trauma bond had already rendered normal environments deeply alienating. The psychological tether soon snapped taut, Dominic called. Her compliance was so ingrained she answered instantly. His voice carried the sharp, possessive edge of a predator losing control. When she lied about being at work, he instantly dismantled the deception, revealing he had already monitored her workplace. His surveillance was absolute. He coldly pressed her, asking if she needed space from his guards or from him. Her disorganized attachment manifested in fragmented answers. Then came the critical inquiry. Had she met with the FBI? Her silence served as a full confession. Before she could manage his anger, his megalomania erupted into absolute command, announcing his imminent arrival. Just as sudden, violent screaming severed the connection. Let us examine the incident that triggered the acute trauma bond. The subject, Lily, reported sitting in the civilian environment of her library when the perimeter breached. Sharp, Concussive gunshots shattered the glass. We see the initial panic response. The autonomic nervous system takes over. She dropped to the floor, her phone scattering amidst the debris. She noted hearing a voice demanding the location of Finha, Lavel's associate. Lily believed the violence was directed at her. The primal terror paralyzed her vocal cords. When her co-worker, Marcus, grabbed her arm, she experienced a severe startle response. His face drained of blood, a classic sympathetic nervous system reaction, as he urged her toward the rear exit, leading her past other paralyzed civilians. In these files, you and I often see how proximity to a megalomaniac narcissist destroys the collateral figures. Marcus pushed her toward the alley, offering himself as a delay tactic. Lily fled, only to be intercepted immediately by an opposing faction. The assailant presented with predatory calmness. When her flight response activated, he exerted physical dominance, violently seizing her hair. The blunt force trauma was accompanied by a psychological strike. He mocked her romantic association with the kingpin. He dragged her toward a transport vehicle while she exhibited a frantic survival struggle. Then, the intervention occurred. The assailant was terminated with a lethal thoracic gunshot as Carlo, the enforcer, materialized out of nowhere, weapon drawn. Carlo executed a tactical advance, eliminating 2 additional hostiles. It was at this juncture that Dominic arrived. To Lily, he appeared to step from the shadows, a common romanticization of the captor. His affect was openly homicidal. He commanded his subordinate to secure Lily in the armored vehicle. As she was pulled away, she observed Dominic's cold focus on the remaining threat, the pure gaze of a territorial predator. A final discharge echoed. Dominic then joined her in the vehicle. Here, the psychological manipulation deepens. He frantically assessed her for physical damage. To the traumatized subject, his trembling hands registered as profound vulnerability, cementing her emotional dependency on the very man who brought extreme violence to her doorstep. Note the Kingpin's rhetoric here. He informed her that the opposing faction, led by Russo, had violated their established parameters. His tone dropped to a lethal register, predicting imminent warfare. He transported her to a fortified location, a classic isolation tactic used to strip the subject of external support systems. Inside the steel and stone compound, he issued an undeniable directive. She was to remain captive under the guise of protection. He framed the attack on the public library as a direct assault on his ego. He assured Lily she was targeted purely as an extension of himself, labeling his rival a coward. It is a brilliant display of narcissism. The trauma inflicted upon innocent civilians is entirely centered around his territorial disputes. When the subject begged him to avoid lethal measures, the narcissist immediately invalidated her moral framework. He weaponized her safety to justify his violent compulsions. He stated that crossing the line of hurting her demanded the ultimate penalty, framing his impending murders as a noble sacrifice. He declared he would rather die protecting her than live with the failure of leaving her exposed. This was punctuated by a desperate physical affection, meant to bind her to him before his departure. He left her isolated in the fortress with Carlo and 6 armed guards. As the hours stretched, Lily was left entirely to her own spiraling cognition. Sitting in a barren room, rejecting sustenance, her nervous system remained locked in hyper-vigilant terror. The updates she received were intentionally vague, further eroding her sense of autonomy. At midnight, urgent vocalizations triggered another spike in her cortisol levels. The Kingpin appeared in the doorway, coated in biological matter. Her immediate response was extreme distress, which he mitigated by clarifying the blood belonged predominantly to his victims. Notice how she instinctively assumed the caregiver role, discovering minor trauma to his shoulder and ribs. When he announced the termination of Rousseau with absolute bluntness, her normative moral disgust was conspicuously absent. Instead, the Stockholm Syndrome manifests fully. She felt profound relief, though she registered a faint, logical guilt regarding that relief, knowing his rivals would now scatter. He assured her the threat was neutralized, cementing his position as her sole protector. She assisted in sanitizing his wounds, her motor skills compromised by residual tremors. He observed her with a carefully calibrated expression of raw dependency. When she expressed severe guilt, whispering that he should have abandoned her to prevent the bloodshed, he shut down the narrative. He deployed classic manipulative flattery, labeling her the singular positive force in his existence. He claimed he would incinerate the entire world to maintain possession of her. The trauma bond reached its apex here. She initiated physical contact, tasting the residue of extreme violence, and officially crossed the psychological threshold. She refused to assist federal investigators. He reinforced her isolation by dismissing her past, stating he only cared about their union. He framed her ethical collapse as a romantic sacrifice. She was choosing his criminal reality over her conscience, and he was choosing her over his empire. It is a masterful destruction of her previous identity. He embraced her, allowing a display of emotional fracture, even as her logical brain murmured that she should flee. Her psychological conditioning held her firmly in place. They remained physically entangled for an extended period, two subjects validating each other's irrational choices in the immediate wake of a massacre. Lily's internal monologue finalized the cognitive distortion. She embraced the permanence of the attachment, accepting the catastrophic consequences. You and I must pay close attention to her interactions with authority figures. Post-incident, 3 days later, Agent Martinez initiated contact, noting the subject's evasive behavior. The agent systematically listed the violent events: the public library assault, the assassination of Rousseau, the historical data regarding Laval. Lily deployed absolute denial. When the agent offered state protection in exchange for cooperation, the subject vehemently rejected the intervention, asserting her autonomy while entirely under the kingpin's control. She terminated the connection. The narcissist, observing from the controlled environment of his private study, casually acknowledged the interaction. They utilized his residence as a secure facility while he managed the vacuum. The kingpin anticipated the federal strategy, predicting threats of obstruction charges. He approached her, verbally acknowledging the magnitude of her sacrifice, further cementing the transactional nature of their bond. Lily repressed any critical analysis, stating her choice was final. Yet, cognitive dissonance inevitably surfaces when the subject re-enters normative society. The following week, she integrated back into her workplace. The structural damage had been repaired, but the psychological contamination remained palpable. Her peers exhibited avoidance behaviors. In the staff area, her colleague Emma confronted her directly. Emma highlighted the undeniable reality. Federal agents were investigating, and Lily had imported lethal violence into a civilian space. Emma verbalized the exact ethical failure the subject had been repressing. She accused Lily of prioritizing a criminal predator over the safety of her community. When Lily weakly protested, Emma delivered the clinical truth. The choice had already been finalized, and the civilians were the collateral. Left alone, Lily experienced a fleeting moment of lucidity, questioning her own pathological selfishness. That evening, on the Kingpin's secure terrace, she sought reassurance from the very source of her trauma. She confessed her colleague's hatred. Dominic's response was a chilling display of dark triad traits. He completely identified with the violence, stating that he was the danger itself, and Lily immediately rushed to validate his fractured humanity. She challenged his perception, noting that normative society viewed her strictly through the lens of his criminality. She then sought absolute validation, asking if he experienced remorse for their entanglement. His manipulation here is textbook. He claimed regret only for the collateral damage inflicted upon her life, her employment, her social network, her mental equilibrium, while aggressively affirming his possessive love. He anchored his obsession to their initial encounter, romanticizing her early, healthy suspicion of him. The subject's emotional regulation collapsed entirely. Through tears, she confessed her reciprocal attachment, openly acknowledging the irrationality of her feelings. 2 weeks later, the external reality intruded via federal correspondence. The document was a formal psychological pressure tactic. It documented her refusal to participate in the investigation. The agency outlined the severe legal ramifications of maintaining proximity to a known syndicate leader, advising a complete reversal of her behavioral pattern. Crucially, they informed her that she was now an active subject in their database. Any tangential connection to illicit operations would trigger immediate prosecution. It was a terminal warning. When she presented the documentation to the narcissist that evening, his reaction was dismissive of the state apparatus. He correctly identified it as an intimidation strategy, noting its effectiveness on her nervous system. Rather than address the peril, he asserted control over the abstract threat. Let's look at this piece by piece, shall we? When external pressure becomes untenable, the captor often proposes geographic relocation to finalize the isolation. He suggested an indefinite departure to regions outside federal jurisdiction. When she questioned the logistics, he confidently delegated authority to his subordinates. He presented a fabricated narrative of exhaustion, manipulating her empathy to frame this escape as an act of devotion. He offered a grand illusion, a legitimate life financed by illicit resources across Europe, Asia, or South America. To the subject suffering from acute Stockholm syndrome, this concept of an isolated utopia was a potent narcotic, total separation from consequence, just the megalomaniac and his entirely devoted captive. Lily worries about the federal authorities, but Dominic dismisses them with the effortless arrogance of an apex predator. He frames his retreat not as cowardice, but as a noble sacrifice for her. This is a masterful psychological manipulation. By claiming he has been strong for everyone else, and now wishes to be selfish, he triggers Lily's deep-seated Stockholm syndrome. She looks at the man who has committed atrocities and sees only a misunderstood protector. She agrees to run. Within 2 weeks, assets are quietly laundered through untraceable channels, and she severs her final ties to normalcy. The tragic reality is that isolating a victim from their support system is always the predator's final move. Packing her belongings, Lily officially sheds her former identity. This ego death is necessary for the trauma bond to finalize. At the precipice of their departure, Dominic employs a classic coercive tactic, the illusion of an exit. He offers her a final chance to return to her normal life, knowing with absolute certainty that her psychological dependency will prevent her from leaving. She interrupts him with a kiss, validating his twisted experiment. She insists she is safest with him, a profound cognitive distortion. Even facing a lifetime of paranoia, she chooses her captor. He then produces a small velvet box. We must remember that in the mechanics of control, every gift is fundamentally a chain. The velvet box contains a single, elegant diamond. Notice the language Dominic uses during this proposal. He does not promise stability or normalcy, things a healthy psyche requires. Instead, he promises absolute devotion and protection, reinforcing his role as her sole provider of security. He asks her to build a new world with him, effectively demanding she abandon objective reality for his shared delusion. Her tearful, unhesitating acceptance is the pinnacle of Stockholm Syndrome. She accepts the ring not as a symbol of partnership, but as a brand of ownership. He kisses her with a desperate intensity. The lesson is hauntingly clear. Sometimes, the most dangerous traps are forged from promises of love. But you and I must look closely at the morning of their departure. They leave at dawn, accompanied only by his enforcer, Carlo. The destination is withheld from Lily until they are securely aboard his private jet, a tactic designed to maintain total psychological dominance. He reveals they are heading to a remote Greek island, a safe house purchased years prior. It is an environment entirely controlled by the megalomaniac narcissist. She tests the word Greece on her tongue, blinded by the false promise of exploration. He takes her hand, sealing the physical isolation. It is a fundamental truth of human behavior that a gilded cage is still a cage, regardless of the breathtaking view it offers the captive. As the private jet ascends, Lily experiences a physiological release. She believes she is leaving the violence and fear behind, interpreting her adrenaline drop as genuine peace. Dominic, ever the architect of her reality, probes her emotional state. He asks if she harbors any regrets. He even plants the suggestion that she might miss her old life, a calculated test of her conditioning. She assures him she will never regret him. A textbook response from a successfully isolated victim. She mistakenly equates her past desire for safety with cowardice. We see this often in clinical settings. The human mind will rewrite its own history to justify the terrible choices it feels compelled to make in the present. Lily arrives for us at a profound yet entirely fabricated psychological conclusion. She convinces herself that submitting to a dangerous criminal has somehow granted her true freedom. The Greek island serves as the perfect incubator for this shared psychosis. It is a stunning, isolated villa overlooking the sea, stripped of obvious external threats. For the first week, they regress into a childlike state of pure existence. They sleep, eat, and engage in primal, simple acts like swimming and braiding hair. Dominic claims he has forgotten what peace feels like, but do not be deceived. For a narcissistic apex predator, peace is merely temporary sensory deprivation. True contentment is an illusion when your identity requires dominance. The facade begins to crack under the quiet pressure of isolation. During a sunset conversation, Lily asks if he misses his former power. Dominic confesses that he misses his purpose, his structural role as a god in his underworld. He accurately identifies their Greek retreat as a temporary vacation, while Lily desperately clings to the delusion of permanence. She asks what he truly wants. He lies, claiming he wants to be normal and boring, a fundamental impossibility for his pathology. A narcissist cannot survive without a mirror, without a kingdom to rule. Yet, they proceed with their fantasy, marrying on the beach 6 weeks later. It reminds us that ignoring a fundamental truth does not make it disappear. We are now forced to observe the clinical absurdity of their wedding ceremony. There are no guests, only a local official entirely oblivious to the criminal gravity of the groom. The vows they exchange are a masterclass in pathological dependency. Lily promises to stand beside him when the dark world comes calling, effectively swearing allegiance to his criminality. Dominic promises to put her first, a vow his narcissistic personality disorder renders literally impossible. He speaks of building a life worth the blood they have spilled, attempting to romanticize his sociopathic tendencies. They seal this delusion with a kiss. To the behavioral analyst, this is simply the formalization of a deeply entrenched trauma bond. Lily reports feeling a profound sense of completeness, a dangerous, euphoric state where the victim entirely absorbs the captor's reality. The heavy trauma of their violent past is temporarily compartmentalized, transmuted into a twisted romantic victory. They exchange declarations of love, reveling in their new types of husband and wife. But psychological reprieves are always temporary. Exactly 3 months into their isolation, the external world shatters their fragile environment. A phone call from his enforcer, Carlo, introduces a severe stressor. The federal authorities have raided his businesses and frozen his assets. The inescapable lesson is that the consequences of our actions will always cross oceans to find us. The crisis escalates as Dominic learns his lieutenants are questioning his leadership. For a megalomaniac, a loss of absolute authority is a psychological death sentence. He attempts to maintain his grand delusion, insisting he can manage a collapsing criminal empire remotely from a Greek beach. Lily, sensing the shift in his neurological baseline, suggests he return. He aggressively denies this, claiming he left that life for her. But the incessant phone calls serve as a metronome of anxiety. His facade crumbles. He paces the terrace, his nervous system flooded with cortisol, entirely unable to sustain the persona of a peaceful husband. It proves that you can change a man's location, but you cannot cure his pathology. After 2 weeks of observing his behavioral deterioration, Lily initiates a fatal pivot. Driven by her Stockholm syndrome, she prioritizes her captor's emotional stabilization over her own safety. She commands him to return to the violence, to handle his chaotic empire, and then return to her. Dominic feigns reluctance, a manipulative tactic to ensure the separation is framed as her idea. She explicitly states she does not want him to resent her for pulling him away from his true nature. She is attempting to manage the emotional volatility of a predator. The tragedy here is profound. We often destroy our own sanctuary, trying to soothe the internal demons of those we mistakenly believe we have the power to save. Dominic pulls her close, securing his emotional tether before he departs. He leaves a week later, restoring his natural equilibrium as a kingpin returning to his war. He kisses her at dawn, leaving her guarded by Carlo and 2 unfamiliar men, effectively transitioning her status from a wife back to a heavily guarded prisoner. The villa instantly becomes an echoing tomb. Lily attempts to maintain a routine, wandering the island in a state of emotional dissociation. Their nightly phone calls become her only lifeline to reality. He discusses legal maneuvers and damage control, pulling her right back into his toxic web. It highlights a dark truth. Isolation without purpose is merely a different form of psychological torture. Come with me to the breaking point of this case file. Dominic promises his return in 3 to 4 weeks, feeding her the breadcrumbs of a future they will never possess. He weaves a fantasy of relocating to a European city, an environment where she could experience a semblance of normalcy. It is a calculated dosage of hope administered to keep her compliant. But the chaotic variables of a criminal lifestyle cannot be controlled by sheer ego. On the 18th day, the inevitable systemic collapse occurs. Carlo informs her of a violent confrontation with federal agents. Dominic has been critically injured. The ultimate lesson of this psychological tragedy is absolute. When you tether your soul to a monster, you will eventually bleed. When the call came, Mrs. Lavelle experienced a sudden cognitive fracture. The voice on the line delivered the blunt trauma. Her husband was in surgery, bleeding, yet clinging to life. The guard, a quiet man conditioned by violence, insisted on following Carlos' strict directives to keep her isolated on the island. It was a classic control tactic by a man accustomed to absolute obedience. But her trauma bond was too deeply rooted. She dismissed his orders, demanding a boat off the island immediately. Her hands shook violently as she packed her bags, driven by a primal, desperate need to return to the architect of her chaos. The flight back felt like an endless psychological descent. She kept dialing the hospital, completely consumed by the manic anxiety of a woman hopelessly tethered to a dangerous man. You and I have reached the critical juncture of her psychological break. The subject endured an 18-hour period of profound emotional starvation, trying to contact his subordinates. When she accessed his medical facility, she faced the visual trauma of his deterioration. The megalomaniac, despite being on life support, attempted to reassert control by chastising her presence. She responded with an aggressive display of devotion, physically claiming his hand. She interpreted his severe gunshot trauma not as a violent consequence of his pathology, but as a personal offense against their bond. He rewarded her defiance with a validating smile. The subject was now inextricably bound to the very violence she had feared, completely consumed by the Stockholm Syndrome. Let us examine this dynamic closely. Carlos survived because a federal agent missed his vital organs, shattering his shoulder instead. When Mrs. Lavelle reached his bedside, her tears were a mix of severe exhaustion and profound dependency. He masked his physical vulnerability with sheer arrogance, claiming he was simply too stubborn to die. She pressed her face against his hand, shaking with terror at the thought of losing him. He requires her absolute devotion to fuel his ego, and she relies on his survival to ground her reality. His recovery was agonizingly slow, demanding 2 weeks in a hospital bed and a month of grueling physical therapy. At the exact same time, the federal inquiry quietly stalled out, paralyzed entirely by the highly questionable nature of the shooting. As authorities withdrew, his syndicate reorganized, pivoting to legitimate businesses. The couple orchestrated a deliberate escape, avoiding the isolation of Greece and the overt risks of New York. They secured an apartment in Barcelona, overlooking the sea. Carlos peddled his tactical intellect to private security firms, while she retreated into the quiet order of a library. They built a careful, private facade of normalcy. Yet, the human nervous system keeps a strict ledger of trauma. Nighttime brought brutal flashbacks. He would wake violently, gasping for air, and she would flinch at the slightest noise. They clung to each other in the dark to soothe their fractured minds. 6 months post-shooting, they sat on their balcony together, watching the Spanish city lights flicker into life, pretending the worst was over. She asked if he ever regretted the power he surrendered. His response revealed a flaw in his psychological armor. He admitted he missed the control daily, but claimed her presence justified the sacrifice. He offered the illusion of choice, suggesting a return to the underworld. She rejected it instantly. He rationalized their violent history as a necessary evil, framing their current peace as his grand design. He convinced her that their severe trauma only proved the unbreakable reality of their bond. He pulled her close while the city hummed below them, a perfect picture of mutual denial. The underlying paranoia remained completely intact. Somewhere in the shadows, rival threats still existed, and federal authorities were likely monitoring their every move. His old enemies undoubtedly harbored desires for violent retaliation, yet they insulated themselves with the romantic notion that their connection was a shield. They believed they had navigated darkness to find light, choosing trauma bonding over basic safety. As the first stars appeared above Barcelona, she experienced a rare moment of clarity. She recognized this was no fairy tale. Their existence would always be uncertain, perpetually shadowed by a violent past they could never escape. But she embraced the chaos because the delusion belonged to them both. Here is the simple life lesson we can extract from this clinical file. Human beings will gladly endure extraordinary pain and constant danger, simply to avoid the terrifying reality of facing the world entirely alone.